Hey kids, this is Ivan. How you doing? Today I'm just going to talk about the saving throws in my new version of D&D and just go talk about what I've done with that. A lot of the stuff I've talked about in the past, I had this way too long version on saves in last season, if you will. But I really kind of examined a bunch of stuff with them. So I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do. Even though I'm using a basic platform, I like the first edition saves a lot better. So that's what I'm using for the most part. So in terms of what the saving throws are, I've kind of also kind of squished the names to kind of go with the Lamentations of the Flame Princess motif, because I like what he did with the saves in terms of just the names. So there's Poison, which would cover all instant KO effects, death magic, the whole 9 yards. There's Paralysis, which would cover a lot of like any kind of body affecting stuff. So it would be like Petrification or Petrifaction, which is a real word, and Polymorph, and perhaps even things like Hold Person. There's breath weapons, dragon breath, any other kind of breath weapon you can think of. But he also made that include like a lot of area of effect spells, like Fireball. And I think that's actually kind of a good idea because it's this big giant effect you're trying to jump out of. There's also spells, which for the most part handle just about any other magical type thing that you might have to save against. And once again, with the caveat that I've talked about before, that if you're saving versus something cast out of an item, it might be some wands, it might be rods, staffs, magic items, you get to add +1 to your save because you're not saving against the power of this wizard that has it behind it. Of course, if you're saving versus something like an artifact, you might take a negative because those are just very powerful items. And the last one I just stole from Basic, and that's wands, which I talked about before. You're kind of jumping out of the way of a gun, so certain wands will do that. They have this very limited area of effect. You need to say, oh crap, let me jump out of the way. And likewise, I use that for traps because it's the same thing. You're jumping out of the way. Oh crap. I also really dug the Castles and Crusades modifiers to all the saves, and they're based on all 6 ability scores. They don't always match up 1-to-1, so sometimes you have to kind of think about, what am I saving against here? I'm going to use this global save, but then I can also add like something, like a modifier based on my scores. So strength would be something like paralysis and constriction. You're really trying to fight it. Intelligence would be any kind of illusion, and any kind of arcane spells that aren't really, covered with something else. Wisdom would be divine magic, gaze attacks, petrification, polymorphing, that sort of thing. Dexterity would be anything you can like associate with reflex. So it would be traps, it would be breath weapons, big area of effect type things, maybe some wands, that sort of thing. Constitution would be disease, energy drain, and poison. And charisma, because I really dig the idea that charisma is more force of will than anything else. That would be things like death attacks, magical at least, any kind of charm type spells, and fear. And also encumbrance, how much you're carrying is going to affect your saves, based on dexterity. So if you're unencumbered, you'll be able to jump out of the way faster and get another +1. If you're really encumbered, you might take like a -1 or -2 to that save, which makes sense because you've got all this crap on you, and it's tougher to jump out of the way. One of the things I've also done with casters is I haven't done that really high-level thing they do in 2nd edition, nor have I done anything with intelligence or wisdom being behind these saves, but I've taken the basic caster level. So if a caster is from 1st to 4th level, you don't have to adjust your save whatsoever. If they're from like 5th to 8th, you get a -1 because they have more mojo behind their spells. 9th through 12th, you get a -2. 13th through 16th level caster, you get a -3. 17th through 20th, you get a -4. And if the guy should happen to be really powerful in 21st level or above, then you can take a -5 to your save. And I think that's fair because these wizards just have more, force behind their spells. The other thing I did, which I talked about in my 20 questions video in response to Tetsubo before, was the idea that I think it's a little crappy to make a save versus something that might give you half damage and still die. I think if you've been able to roll a saving throw and you did pretty good at that, you ought to be mostly dead. Maybe you're down to 0 hit points or negative hit points, and at that point you won't be dying. You're going to be mostly dead, and people are going to need to get your butt out of there. But at least you lived, because you made this great save. Versus those kind of things. Racially wise, yeah, some races get some modifiers. Halflings get +2 to poison and magic, which is pretty standard. Gnomes get +2 to magic, and they also incur a -2 penalty to anybody else viewing their illusions because they're a little kind of illusion based. Half elves, on the other hand, they don't really get any like adjustments, but they're 30% resistant to sleep and charm type spells, all the various charm type spells. However, if they fail that, they're still going to have to make a save. Likewise, elves are 90% resistant, which is classic. And then, if they fail that, they're still going to have to make a save. But they have a pretty good chance of just avoiding all those kind of things. And then dwarves, they have a +2 against magic and versus poison. The only real adjustment I made to that is should you play a magic user and you're going to be like a halfling or like a gnome or a dwarf, you're not going to get that +2 versus poison, because at this point you're kind of bucking the system and you're being a little non-conventional. But I don't think that's unfair, because magic users have such great saves versus magic. I think it all kind of washes out. So I think that's fair to do something like that. Other than that, just the whole I really dig the whole mojo of the first edition saves. You're gonna I use a granular approach, so you don't have to wait, like 4 levels to go up by +2. I think that's simple. Anytime you can get an extra 1 to your save, you should get it right away. But fighters start out really crappy against everything, but they have a meteoric rise against everything, even spells, and they tend to do, over time, really well against the things you would consider like fortitude-based, if you will, like poison and paralyzation and whatnot. Magic users, on the other hand, they start out really good against a lot of stuff, and they continue to get really good against magic, but not so much against paralyzation and petrification, because that's just not their vibe. Thieves, on the other hand, they do really well against a lot of saves to begin with, and they get better and better, especially against reflex type things. The one thing I didn't like is the first edition save progression versus breath weapons, because I thought thieves ought to be able to jump out of the way relatively good. So I have that equal what clerics get, and I think thieves should be able to do that. And then, of course, classically clerics do really good against poison and paralysis and things right out of the gate. And eventually they don't advance as far as fighters do, but their saves are pretty good. So that's what I'm doing with saving throws. I think it's fair, and I think it's a good system. And like I said before, also in the 20 questions, a lot of times I'll give you an out. If you fail a save versus poison or paralysis, depending on the monster, depending on what's going on, I'm going to give you an out, like we'll roll a d6 or something, and you might be violently ill or slightly paralyzed to completely paralyzed or dead. And so just give you a bit of an out that way. And of course, any and all saves are totally situational. Some monsters have worse poison, some spells or some weird effects could be more beneficial to you or less beneficial, that sort of thing. If you say you're going to do something very smart, you're going to bonus to your save. So that's what I'm doing with saving throws.